The bells of St. Winthrop Cathedral rang out like hollow echoes of fate, their sombre notes rolling through the grey morning mist. Inside, the air was heavy with perfume and judgment. Every noble in attendance had come to witness what society whispered was not a wedding, but a transaction. Lady Amelia Ravenshade, daughter of a disgraced baron, stood trembling at the altar, a vision of quiet dignity wrapped in white lace and sorrow. She had been sold, not in name, of course. The Ton preferred more elegant phrasing. They called it a necessary alliance, an arrangement for survival, a union of convenience. But Amelia knew better. Her father's gambling debts had drowned their family, and the only lifeline left was the Duke of Ashbourne, a man with enough wealth and influence to erase scandal. All he asked in return was her hand. The Duke stood beside her now, broad-shouldered and immaculately dressed in black, his expression carved from stone. Lord Damien Ashbourne, the cruel Duke. The papers described him as brilliant, cold, and dangerously unapproachable. It was said he had inherited his title too young, his heart hardening under the weight of betrayal and ambition. He was a man who saw everything as a bargain to be won, never a bond to be cherished. To him, this marriage was just that, a bargain. He hadn't looked at her once since the ceremony began. Not when she walked down the aisle with trembling hands, not when she whispered her vows, not even when the priest asked him to pledge his fidelity. His words were spoken flatly, as though reciting terms from a contract. "I do." 2 syllables, lifeless and final. Amelia repeated hers softly, the sound nearly lost under the choir's hymn. Her heart ached, not for love, she had never expected that, but for the dream of it. Somewhere deep inside, a part of her still longed to believe that even in a world ruled by power and greed, affection could bloom. When the priest announced them husband and wife, Damien offered his arm out of obligation, not warmth. He led her down the aisle, past faces half curious, half scornful. She could hear the whispers following her like shadows. The baron's daughter, bought by a duke. He'll tire of her within a season. Poor thing, she's far too gentle for him. Her new husband heard them too, she was sure, yet he gave no sign of offence, no gesture of defence. His silence was colder than cruelty. At the grand reception that followed in Ashbourne Hall, the opulence was blinding. Chandeliers glittered like frost, the tables overflowed with gold and crystal, and a string quartet played music so delicate it could have broken under the weight of the guests' hypocrisy. Emilia sat beside Damien at the head of the table, her smile fragile, her fingers clenched beneath the linen. He spoke little, his replies curt whenever someone addressed him. To the world, they looked like the perfect picture of control, a powerful duke and his beautiful new bride. But under the table, where no one could see, their distance was a chasm. When the toasts began, Lord Blackwell, an old friend of the Duke's known for his cruel humour, stood with his glass raised high. "To our gracious Duke, who has proven that even the most ruined fortune can be properly purchased." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Amelia froze. Her chest tightened, her throat burned, but she said nothing. She lowered her gaze, pretending to smile. But the laughter grew, cruel, mocking, merciless. Damien didn't stop it. He didn't laugh either, just sat there, unmoving, eyes dark and distant. To her, his silence was confirmation of everything she had feared. This marriage was nothing but a bargain. Later, when the hall emptied and the night grew quiet, she stood by her window, staring out into the moonlit gardens. Her gown shimmered faintly in the silver light, but her heart felt heavy, dull. lifeless. Behind her, the Duke's voice broke the silence. "You'll find your quarters in the East Wing. I've instructed the staff to attend you as they would any duchess." "Any duchess," she repeated softly, her voice trembling. "But not a wife." He paused at the door, his back still turned. "Do not expect affection, Lady Amelia. I have no use for it." And with that, he left her, alone on her wedding night, surrounded by silence more painful than cruelty. Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. The storm that had been brewing within her heart finally broke. Not in rage, but in quiet tears that no one would ever see. Yet fate, ever patient, had plans even for a heart sold in sorrow. Because the same man who walked away from her tonight would one day fall to his knees before her, not out of duty, but out of love. The Duke of Ashbourne ruled his household the way a general commanded an army, with precision, discipline, and the kind of distance that left no room for warmth. His mansion, vast and magnificent, reflected him perfectly. Beautiful to behold, but cold to the touch. Marble floors gleamed like mirrors, portraits of ancestors stared down from gilded frames, and the staff moved silently through the halls like ghosts who feared to breathe too loudly. Lady Amelia quickly learned that her new life was one of quiet observation. Her days began early, attended by maids who addressed her as Your Grace, with polite formality, but not familiarity. They seemed uncertain whether to pity or envy her. Meals were served at exact hours. Letters from the ton flooded in. Curious invitations from women who wished to inspect the purchased bride. She declined them all. The Duke was seldom present. He spent most of his hours in the study or on business in London, returning only late at night when the hallways were empty. When they crossed paths, their exchanges were polite but sharp-edged, each word measured, each silence deliberate. Once, during her first week as Duchess, she gathered the courage to ask, "Would you care for tea in the garden, Your Grace? The roses are in bloom." He didn't even look up from his papers. "I have no time for flowers, Lady Amelia. Beauty fades, duty does not." His words stung more than she wished to admit. Still she persisted in small ways. She spoke kindly to the servants, laughed softly with the gardener, and made a point of reading to the housekeeper's children when they visited the kitchens. Soon the air within Ashbourne Hall began to change, subtly, almost imperceptibly. The halls no longer felt as suffocatingly still. Someone had dared to open a window, and sunlight now reached the cold stone floors. And that did not go unnoticed. One evening, as Amelia passed the study, she overheard two footmen whispering in the corridor. "She's different from the last one," one said. "The last one?" The other nodded. "He was nearly engaged once, years ago, a Lady Catherine. Broke it off when she was caught with another man. Since then, well, his Grace has been colder than the marble floors." Amelia turned away, heart heavy. So that was the root of his cruelty. Betrayal. A wound that had never healed. Later that week, she found herself seated opposite him at dinner, the candlelight flickering between them. She decided to try again. "You built this house after your father's death, didn't you?" she asked softly. He didn't glance up from his wine. "It is my duty to preserve the Ashbourne legacy. And your happiness." He set down his glass. "My happiness is irrelevant. You don't believe you deserve any?" His eyes snapped to hers then, dark, sharp, almost dangerous. "Deserve?" he repeated. "Happiness is for those who have not seen how easily love can rot into deception." Her chest tightened. "Not all love deceives, my lord." "Every love does eventually," he said flatly. "It is only a matter of when." Amelia lowered her gaze, her fingers tightening around her fork. She could have argued, but something in his tone stopped her. Not the arrogance of a man who thought himself above pain, but the exhaustion of one who had lived too long with it. The silence stretched between them. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke again, his tone quieter this time. "The household runs by certain rules, Lady Amelia. You may entertain guests in the mornings. You will accompany me to public functions when required. Beyond that, your time is your own. I expect discretion and decorum. I will not tolerate gossip or sentiment." "Nor affection, I suppose?" she asked bitterly. His jaw flexed. "Affection complicates what should be simple." "And yet," she murmured, meeting his eyes, "we are not simple beings." For the first time he seemed momentarily at a loss for words. His gaze lingered on her, not in admiration, but in curiosity. She had defied him without raising her voice. He hated that it intrigued him. After that evening, their silent battle continued, his indifference versus her quiet strength. When they appeared together in society, whispers followed them like a shadow. The Duchess was admired for her grace, but pitied for her husband's detachment. Some said she'd never bear his heir, others said he'd discard her within a year. Amelia bore it all with poise, but each cruel remark left its mark. At times she wondered if he ever noticed, if the man beside her, whose arm she held for appearances, ever saw the pain behind her smile. One night she caught him watching her reflection in the ballroom's mirror as she stood alone, surrounded by laughter and conversation that excluded her. For a fleeting second his mask cracked, not enough for anyone else to see, but enough for her to glimpse something buried deep beneath the surface. Regret. It was gone a moment later, replaced by his usual coldness, but the sight of it ignited something inside her, a spark of hope she couldn't quite extinguish. Because beneath the cruelty, beneath the armor, she had seen a man who still could feel. And no matter how much he tried to deny it, she was determined to make him remember what it was to have a heart. The Duke of Ashburn had built his reputation on indifference. In the grand parlours of London, where gossip reigned as ruthlessly as any monarch, he was known as the man impossible to rattle, a figure of power whose heart was as untouchable as his fortune. But that reputation began to tremble the night of the Marquis of Ellington's winter ball. The ballroom glimmered like a sea of jewels. Crystal chandeliers bathed the dancers in golden light, while violins sang beneath the painted ceilings. Nobles mingled, laughed and whispered, the same voices that had mocked Amelia on her wedding day. The Duke arrived with his wife, as duty demanded. Amelia descended the grand staircase on his arm, every inch the Duchess the Ton expected her to be. Serene, composed, radiant. Yet beneath the perfection of her poise, her heart beat painfully fast. She knew what people whispered. The Duke only brings her to prove he has a wife. He never looks at her, never dances with her. They were right. Tonight, she told herself, she would no longer care. When the music began, couples moved elegantly across the marble floor. Amelia stood alone near the edge of the crowd, watching others spin in graceful harmony. Damien, as she had learned to call him privately, though he rarely responded, stood a few feet away, surrounded by men discussing trade and politics, his tone sharp and clipped. He hadn't asked her for a dance, of course. He never did. But another man did. "Your Grace?" said a familiar voice. Amelia turned to find Lord Lucien Harrow, a charming viscount with laughing eyes. "The night is far too lovely to be spent in the shadows. Would you honour me with a waltz?" Amelia hesitated, glancing toward her husband. He didn't look up. She smiled politely. "I suppose one dance cannot harm." The music swelled, and Lucien led her onto the floor. He was kind, easy to talk to, the sort of man who spoke as if every word were meant only for her. When he complimented her grace, she blushed, and for the first time in weeks, she felt seen. But not everyone saw it as innocent. Across the room, Damien's hand tightened around his glass. His conversation faltered mid-sentence. His gaze followed his wife, the delicate arch of her neck, the faint smile she gave another man, the way her gown shimmered like ivory flame as she turned. A muscle ticked in his jaw. "Careful, Ashbourne," muttered Lord Blackwell beside him. "If you glare any harder, people will think you actually care." Damien's glare cut sharper than any blade. "You mistake curiosity for concern." Blackwell smirked. "Ah, yes, curiosity. That's why you've crushed your glass." Damien glanced down. His knuckles were white, and crimson wine trickled down his glove where the stem had snapped. He set it aside with quiet precision, pretending nothing had happened, but, inside, something had. When the waltz ended, Lucien bowed gallantly, murmuring, "I dare say the Duke is a lucky man, though he seems unaware of it." "Good evening, my lord," came a deep voice behind them. Emilia froze. Damien stood there, his presence cold and commanding, though his eyes burned with something darker than anger, jealousy. "Your Grace," Lucien greeted lightly, unruffled. "I was merely keeping your lady entertained." Damien's jaw tightened. "My wife requires no one's entertainment." Lucien's smile didn't fade. "Then perhaps you should be the one to dance with her." A challenge, subtle but deadly. The surrounding guests fell silent, sensing tension. Emilia's breath caught. Before she could speak, Damien extended his hand to her, not gently, but firmly. "My lady," he said through clenched teeth, "may I have this dance?" Every eye in the room followed them as they stepped onto the floor. The orchestra hesitated, then resumed, slower, softer, as though even the music feared to intrude. Damien's hand rested at her waist, his touch taut with restrained emotion. They moved in perfect rhythm, their bodies close, yet their hearts oceans apart. "Was that wise?" he murmured, his voice low. "Accepting a dance?" she replied evenly. "Perhaps not, but I was tired of being invisible." His grip tightened fractionally. "You are far from invisible, Emilia." "Am I?" Her eyes lifted to his. "Then why do you never look at me?" He didn't answer. The silence between them was louder than the music. When the final note lingered in the air, they stood motionless, still locked in each other's gaze. The onlookers held their breath. Then, with deliberate calm, Damien bowed. "Thank you for the dance, Duchess." He led her off the floor, and for the first time since their marriage, the Tun saw something they had never seen before. The cruel Duke, the man who treated his bride like a contract, had claimed her publicly. The whispers that followed were different this time. "Did you see the way he looked at her?" Perhaps the Duchess is not as powerless as we thought. That night, as they returned to Ashbourne Hall in the quiet carriage, the air between them was heavy with something unspoken. Emilia stared out the window. "You didn't need to defend your pride," she said softly. "I wasn't defending my pride," he murmured, without looking at her. "I was defending what is mine." The words should have angered her, and perhaps they did. But beneath the possessive edge there was something raw, unguarded. For the first time, his cruelty sounded almost like confession. The morning after the winter ball, Ashbourne Hall was unusually quiet. The servants moved with hushed footsteps, their glances darting between the Duke and Duchess as though afraid the air itself might ignite. Something had shifted the night before, though no one could quite name it. Amelia awoke to find sunlight spilling through the tall windows of her chamber, a rare warmth after days of grey skies. Yet her thoughts were restless. She could still feel the press of Damien's hand at her waist, the restrained power of his touch, the tension that had charged the air between them. He had danced with her before everyone, not out of affection, she reminded herself, but out of possession. And yet, it hadn't felt empty. When she descended to breakfast, she found him already seated at the long mahogany table reading a letter. His posture, as always, was perfect, spine straight, expression unreadable. But his eyes flicked toward her as she entered. A brief glance, quick, almost reluctant. But it was more acknowledgement than she had received in weeks. "Good morning, Your Grace," she greeted quietly. He folded the letter. "You are late." "I wasn't aware we had fixed an hour," she replied, pouring herself tea. "You are the Duchess of this house. Punctuality reflects discipline." "And discipline reflects control," she said softly, not looking up. "You do love control, don't you, my lord?" The teacup trembled slightly in her hand when she realized she had spoken aloud. But instead of anger, she heard him give a faint, humorless chuckle. "I learned long ago," he said, "that control is the only thing that cannot betray you." She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time saw not just arrogance, but exhaustion. A man who carried not just power, but ghosts. After breakfast, she walked through the gardens, seeking quiet. She had begun tending the neglected roses, not because she had to, but because it gave her purpose in this cold, perfect world. As she knelt by a wilted bush, she heard footsteps behind her. "I see you've found a new battlefield," Damien said dryly. She glanced up, surprised. "I didn't think you noticed where I went." "I notice everything." "Then you must have noticed these roses were dying." "They were never meant to survive the winter," he replied, his tone even. Emilia smiled faintly. "Then perhaps they need someone stubborn enough to try." He studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "You exhaust yourself over hopeless causes." "And yet," she murmured, meeting his gaze, "here you are, standing among them." That silenced him. He turned away first. Over the following days, the distance between them began to shrink, almost without intention. She would find him lingering near the library doorway while she read, pretending to search for a book he never took. Once, she caught him watching as she laughed with a maid over tea. He looked away, but not quickly enough. There were moments, fleeting, fragile, when the cruelty melted, replaced by something gentler, though he fought it fiercely. One evening, during a storm that shook the house, she heard the clatter of glass from the study. She hurried in and found him standing beside the hearth, his hand bleeding where he had smashed a decanter. "Damien!" she cried, rushing to him. "What happened?" He turned sharply, his voice rough. "Leave it!" "Don't be absurd," she said, grabbing a cloth and taking his hand before he could pull away. "You'll ruin the carpet with your pride." He stared down at her, at the earnest worry in her eyes, the gentle touch of her fingers, and something inside him cracked. "You shouldn't care," he said quietly. "And you shouldn't bleed alone," she replied. Her words hit him like a blow. For a heartbeat, he forgot how to breathe. When she finished binding his hand, neither spoke. The firelight flickered between them, painting his face in shades of gold and shadow. Finally, he murmured, "You think me cruel." "I think you're human," she said softly. "And that frightens you." He almost smiled. Not mockingly, but sadly. "You assume there's anything left of humanity in me?" She looked at him steadily. "I wouldn't have married a monster." He blinked, startled by the quiet conviction in her voice. "You didn't have a choice." "Perhaps not," she said, her tone steady. "But I choose what I see now. And I see a man who's forgotten how to be kind, because kindness once cost him everything." He stared at her, the silence heavy, electric. The storm raged outside, but in that moment, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, the broken Duke and the woman he had tried not to feel for. Before she could speak again, he turned abruptly and left the room, but this time he didn't slam the door. And though she couldn't know it then, her words had followed him, echoing in the one place he had long forbidden emotion to reach: his heart. 2 weeks later, the Ashbournes received an invitation from the Duchess of Wycliffe, one of London's most viciously curious hostesses. Her gatherings were renowned not for grace, but for gossip. Every scandal of the ton began, ended, or was reborn within her candle-lit ballroom. Emilia hesitated when the embossed letter arrived. "Do we have to attend?" she asked quietly, watching Damien read it. "We do," he said curtly, setting it aside. "Declining would only feed rumours." She gave a small, mirthless smile. "As if they need feeding." That earned her a flicker of amusement, so brief she almost missed it. "You've grown bolder, my lady." "Perhaps cruelty makes for an excellent teacher," she replied, lifting her chin. He looked at her for a long moment, studying her like one might a painting whose beauty was unexpected. "You surprise me, Emilia." "And you confuse me," she whispered, before leaving the room. The night of the ball shimmered with splendour. The Duchess of Wycliffe's mansion gleamed with golden light, and the scent of perfume and arrogance hung heavy in the air. Emilia entered on Damien's arm, her gown a breathtaking shade of pale rose, delicate but strong, just like her. As always, eyes turned their way. Whispers followed. "The bargain bride. A pity he barely looks at her." Though one wonders, for how long? Damien's expression remained impassive, but she could feel the tension in the arm he offered her. He heard them. And perhaps for the first time, it seemed to wound his pride, not as a duke, but as a man. Throughout the evening he stayed close but silent, answering questions about his estate and business with clipped authority. Yet when his wife spoke about art, charity, or literature, people actually listened. Her wit, her kindness, her quiet elegance began to shift the room's perception. And Damien noticed. Every word she spoke seemed to soften something inside him he hadn't realized was still capable of softening. But peace never lasts long where envy lingers. It was during supper that the venom surfaced. Lady Clarisse Morton, a widow known for her beauty and for having once sought Damien's favour, leaned close to a cluster of guests at their table. Her voice was sweet, her tone dripping with malice. "Isn't it tragic?" she sighed. "Poor Lady Emilia, to be purchased like fine china, only to sit on display. I hear the Duke hasn't even shared her bed." The table went still. The words, like poison, spread fast. Laughter, cruel and muffled, followed. Emilia's fork froze halfway to her lips. Her heart hammered, her face burning. The humiliation was suffocating. But before she could flee, a chair scraped sharply against the floor. Damien rose to his full height, his presence towering, eyes like storm clouds ready to break. "Lady Morton," he said coldly, every syllable cutting through the silence. "You seem remarkably informed about matters that are none of your concern." She blinked, flustered. I meant no—" "Insult?" His voice sharpened. "You dared to humiliate my wife in public and think it amusement?" The crowd held its breath. "Let me be clear. he continued, his tone glacial. "The Duchess of Ashburn is not some curiosity to be discussed. She is my wife, and the only person in this room deserving of respect." Gasps rippled through the hall. Lady Morton stammered, "Your Grace, I—" "Be silent," he commanded. "You forget your place." Then, without another glance at her, he turned to Amelia. His voice softened, just slightly. "My lady, I believe we have overstayed the pleasure of this company." He offered her his hand, and before the entire ballroom, the same people who had mocked her, the same faces that had pitied her, he led her out with his head held high, his hand never leaving hers. Outside, the carriage awaited. The moment the door closed behind them, the silence was deafening. Amelia turned toward him, her breath shaking. "You didn't have to do that?" "Yes, I did," he said quietly. "You defended me," she whispered. "After all this time." He met her gaze, no mask, no armor, just truth. "No one insults my wife." Something in his tone made her pulse quicken. It wasn't possession this time, it was protection. The carriage jolted as they began to move through the rain-slicked streets. Neither spoke for a long while. The air between them pulsed with unspoken words. Finally, Amelia said softly, "You made me believe you had no heart." He looked away, voice barely audible. "Perhaps I was wrong to try to bury it." Her eyes softened. "And what woke it, my lord?" His gaze flicked to her, dark and uncertain. "You did." Outside, thunder rumbled again. But for the first time it felt like promise, not doom. The days after the Wycliffe ball felt strangely altered, as though the world itself had shifted in its axis. The Duke's defence of Amelia had not gone unnoticed. It spread through London like wildfire. Overnight, whispers changed their tone. "Did you hear?" He silenced Lady Morton in front of everyone. Perhaps the Duke is not so heartless after all. Or perhaps he's fallen for his Duchess. Amelia tried to ignore the gossip, but even she couldn't dismiss the truth that something had changed, not only in the Tun, but between her and Damien. The morning after the ball, she expected distance. She expected him to retreat once more behind his fortress of composure. Instead, he joined her for breakfast, unannounced, uninvited, and shockingly calm. She blinked as he entered. "You're early." "I find myself unused to sleeping," he said, seating himself opposite her. "Too many thoughts." She poured him tea without a word. For a few minutes, silence ruled, the soft clink of porcelain the only sound between them. Then, unexpectedly, he spoke. "You handled yourself with remarkable grace last night." "I had little choice," she said softly. "When one is married to a man feared by all, one learns composure quickly." He looked at her, an unreadable expression flickering across his face. "Feared? You are not easy to love, my lord." His lips twitched, almost a smile, though tinged with bitterness. "Then you are the only one brave enough to try." Her teacup halted halfway to her lips. "I never said I—" "No," he interrupted gently. "You didn't. But you haven't left me either." Their eyes met, and for a moment the air between them felt charged, fragile yet alive. He looked away first. Later that afternoon, rain began to fall again. Amelia found herself wandering toward the library, drawn by the soft crackle of the hearth. The Duke was there, sitting by the fire, an open book forgotten in his lap. She hesitated in the doorway. "I didn't expect you'd be home so early." "I cancelled my trip to London," he said without looking up. "Why?" He hesitated, then glanced at her. "Perhaps I prefer conversation here." Her heart stumbled in her chest. That's Unexpected. He gestured toward the armchair across from him. Sit. I owe you a debt of honesty. She did, folding her hands in her lap. The flickering light softened the lines of his face, no longer cruel, but weary, human. I wasn't supposed to care, he said quietly. When I agreed to this marriage, it was for convenience. You were a means to an end. But last night when they laughed at you... He paused, swallowing hard. Something inside me snapped. Amelia's breath caught. You felt pity? No, he said, meeting her gaze. Pity is easy. What I felt was rage, because they didn't see what I see. She frowned slightly. And what do you see, my lord? His eyes softened, dark and full of a truth he had long buried. A woman who holds her head high, even when the world tries to break her. A woman who refuses to be silenced, even by me. Her throat tightened. You make me sound stronger than I am. You are stronger than you know, he murmured. Stronger than me. The silence stretched, intimate and trembling. The storm outside beat against the windows, but neither moved. Finally, Amelia whispered, Then why do you still keep your distance? He closed his eyes briefly. Because I don't trust what I feel. You don't trust me, she said quietly. I don't trust myself around you, he corrected. Her breath hitched, the words sinking into her chest like a confession she'd been waiting to hear. And if you did? He stood abruptly, pacing to the window. If I did, I'd forget every vow I made to never love again. She rose slowly, stepping closer until her reflection merged with his in the glass. Then forget them, she whispered. Just for tonight. He turned to her then, eyes burning, torn between restraint and desire. You don't know what you're asking. I'm asking you, she said, her voice trembling but firm, to stop pretending you don't care. For a heartbeat, time froze. Then he took a step toward her, another. When he finally reached her, his hand rose, hesitating, trembling, before brushing a strand of hair from her face. You're impossible to ignore, he whispered. And you're impossible to understand, she breathed back. The firelight danced across their faces, the storm roared outside, and for the first time, Damien Ashbourne didn't fight what his heart had already surrendered to. He kissed her, not gently, not cruelly, but desperately, like a man rediscovering what it meant to be alive. And for the first time since their bargain began, it felt like something real. For a time, the mansion of Ashbourne felt transformed. The heavy air that once choked its halls now carried warmth. Laughter that drifted from the library, soft piano notes that filled the evening silence, and the occasional smile from the servants who dared believe their duke was finally changing. Damien and Amelia had fallen into a fragile rhythm. He still spoke with formality, still buried himself in work for hours, but there were moments, precious, fleeting moments, where his mask slipped. He began joining her walks in the gardens, always pretending it was by coincidence. He let her choose the books they read aloud in the evenings, his deep voice softening over poetry he once would have mocked. And sometimes, when no one was watching, he reached for her hand, not as an obligation, but as a man reaching for peace. For Amelia, it was a quiet miracle. She had never dreamed of love, certainly not from him. Yet every look, every small act of tenderness chipped away at the walls that once separated them. One evening, they dined alone by the fire. The rain outside was gentle this time, not thunderous, the kind that lulls the world into stillness. I had forgotten what laughter sounded like in this house, she said softly, sipping her wine. He smiled faintly. It sounds better when it's yours. She glanced at him, startled by the sincerity in his tone. You flatter me. I've never been good at flattery, he said. Only truth. Her chest tightened. Then tell me a truth, my lord. Why did you defend me that night? Not as a husband, but as a man. He hesitated, his gaze flickering toward the fire. Because when they laughed at you, I saw the reflection of what I'd become, a man who stood by while cruelty masqueraded as wit. That's not who you are, she said softly. It was, he murmured. Until you. Her breath trembled. And what am I to you now? His eyes met hers. Everything I swore I'd never need? For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then, without thought, she rose and moved to his side. Her fingers brushed his cheek, her touch gentle as a promise. Then stop fighting it. He covered her hand with his, closing his eyes. I don't deserve your forgiveness. Forgiveness is given to those who ask, she whispered. And when he kissed her again, it wasn't desperation. Oh, it was reverence. But peace, in their world, was a fragile illusion. 2 days later, as Amelia walked through the corridor, she overheard 2 visiting noblemen speaking in hushed tones outside the study. The Duke's former betrothed, Lady Catherine? Did you hear? She's returned from France, quite penniless now, but still determined to reclaim him. Amelia froze. Her blood turned to ice. Lady Catherine, the name that had haunted whispers in every salon and letter, the ghost of his past. That evening, when Damien returned from his ride, she tried to appear calm. You had a visitor today, she said carefully. Lady Catherine. He stiffened, then exhaled. Yes, she came to request financial assistance. Her husband died. And? I offered her a pension through the estate. Did she ask for anything else? His hesitation was small, barely noticeable, but to Amelia it felt like thunder. She asked for forgiveness. For what she did? He nodded once, and I gave it. Amelia turned away, the ache in her chest sharp and sudden. So easily? It cost me nothing, he said, quietly. She laughed, brittle, hollow. No, my lord, it cost me. He blinked, confused. What are you implying? That perhaps I was wrong to believe you capable of feeling anything at all. His expression hardened instantly, the old armor snapping back into place. Do not twist my compassion into betrayal. Compassion, she repeated bitterly. That's what you call it? He took a step closer, eyes flashing. You forget yourself, Amelia. And you forget me, she snapped, her voice trembling. The woman who stood beside you while you built your empire of silence. The woman who tried to love the man everyone else feared. The words hung in the air, like shattered glass. He looked at her. Anger, hurt, pride warring across his face. Love, he said coldly. You speak of it as though it were a debt I owe. Her eyes burned. No, my lord, it's not a debt. It's the only thing you're too afraid to give. And before he could reply, she turned and walked out, past the grand staircase, past the portraits of the emotionless Ashbournes, out into the rain that had begun to fall again. He didn't follow. Not that night. But as the rain struck the windows, Damien stood, motionless in the library, staring into the fire, her words echoing through the hollow chambers of his chest. The only thing you're too afraid to give. He'd faced war, scandal, betrayal. But never had he faced something as terrifying as this. Losing the one person who made him believe he still had a soul. The following morning, the halls of Ashbourne were eerily still. Amelia's chambers stood open, her belongings half packed, the fire in her hearth already cold. Outside, carriages clattered over cobblestones as the servants whispered in confusion. The Duchess and their quiet, kind mistress was leaving. Damien stood in the doorway watching as her maid folded the last of her gowns. His voice, when it came, was low and hollow. "Where has she gone?" The maid curtsied, trembling. "She asked not to be followed, Your Grace. She said she needed to breathe." He turned away before the woman could see the flicker of panic in his eyes. Needed to breathe. The words echoed through his mind, mocking him. He had given her everything a woman could want. Wealth, title, protection, everything but the one thing she'd ever asked for. His heart. He spent the day in restless silence, pacing the study until dusk fell. Every corner of the house seemed emptier, every echo harsher. Her laughter, soft, restrained, but genuine, had left with her. Even the roses she'd revived in the garden drooped again, as though mourning her absence. At first, he told himself she'd return, that she simply needed time. But when the second day passed and there was no word, something inside him began to unravel. He hadn't realized how much of his life had begun to orbit her. The way he looked for her at breakfast, the way her presence softened the air, the way her quiet defiance reminded him he was still human. Without her, the house returned to what it had always been: magnificent, cold, dead. On the third day, unable to bear the silence, Damien rode out. He searched every familiar place: the chapel near the lake, the old bookshop she adored in the village, the meadow where she once said she felt free. But there was no trace of her. Only the wind, carrying whispers of regret he could no longer drown. Finally, at sunset, he found her carriage at the old Ravenshade estate, her childhood home, long abandoned after her father's debts consumed it. She was standing outside, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the crumbling facade as though trying to recognize the ruins of her past. Her hair blew loose in the evening wind, and for a moment she looked ethereal, a memory he was afraid to disturb. He dismounted quietly, his boots crunching against the gravel. "Emilia," he said softly. She stiffened but did not turn. "You shouldn't have come." "I had to." "You always do everything because you have to, Damien," she said bitterly. "Duty, honor, obligation, but never because you want to." He flinched, as if struck. "You think I didn't want you?" She turned then, her eyes glistening with pain and fury. "You wanted me as one wants a possession, a trophy to silence gossip. You defended me because you couldn't bear the stain on your pride, not because you cared for me." He took a step forward, voice trembling. "That's not true." "Then what is true?" she demanded. "Tell me, because I no longer know what to believe." For a long, agonizing moment he said nothing. The wind howled through the trees, carrying the last of the daylight. Finally he spoke, not with the commanding tone of a duke, but with the broken honesty of a man stripped bare. "The truth," he said quietly, "is that I was terrified. Terrified that if I loved you, I'd destroy you the way I destroy everything I touch." Her expression softened, but only slightly. "You don't destroy, Damien. You suffocate. You hide. You bury yourself behind pride until no one can reach you." "I tried to protect you," he whispered. "From me?" "Then you've succeeded," she said, tears glistening. "You've protected me so well I no longer exist to you." He reached for her hand, but she stepped back. "Please," she said brokenly, "don't make this harder." His throat tightened. "What will you do?" "I'll go to my aunt's in Bath. Perhaps there I can remember who I was before this bargain." He exhaled shakily, every muscle in his body taut with restraint. "And what am I to do while you're gone?" "Learn," she whispered. "What it means to want someone, not to own them, not to save them, but to choose them. She turned and climbed into the carriage. He stood there as the horses began to move, the wheels creaking against the gravel. The sight of her retreating figure was like watching sunlight vanish beyond the horizon, leaving only darkness in its wake. For hours after, Damien remained there, motionless, drenched in the cold twilight, haunted by the words he had been too afraid to say when it mattered most. By the time he returned to Ashbourne, the mansion no longer felt like his. Every room was a reminder of her absence. Every silence was a punishment. That night, he sat by the fire, her favorite book open on his lap, his unbandaged hand resting against his chest. For the first time in years, the great Duke of Ashbourne, the man who prided himself on control, bowed his head and whispered into the empty air, "I love you, Amelia, but perhaps too late." And for the first time since his childhood, he wept. The ballroom glittered under the glow of 1,000 candles, each flame reflecting off the gilded mirrors and crystal chandeliers, casting a kaleidoscope of light across the polished marble floors. The air was thick with anticipation, a delicate tension that hung like a finely spun veil over the elegantly dressed guests, who had gathered with curiosity, gossip, and the faintest hints of judgment lingering in their eyes. And there, at the very center of it all, she stood, no longer the trembling, uncertain bride who had been the subject of whispers and dismissive glances, but a woman whose grace, resilience, and quiet dignity commanded attention without a single word. The cruel bargains that had once defined her life, the arrangements, the assumptions, the stifling expectations of wealth and status, seemed to dissolve like mist under the warm, unwavering light of the Duke's gaze. He appeared at her side, as if materializing from the shadows, tall and imposing, yet softened by the rare and radiant tenderness reserved only for her. Every eye in the room followed him, every whispered speculation caught mid-breath as he lifted her hand, guiding her with a certainty that brooked no challenge, a silent proclamation that she was no longer a pawn, no longer a subject of ridicule, but a partner deserving of honor, of recognition, of love that had waited patiently to bloom. As the first notes of the waltz filled the room, the music weaving a spell that seemed to slow time itself, she allowed herself to be drawn into his arms, feeling the steadiness of his presence as a protective force against the cold judgments that still lingered in some corners. The guests watched, captivated, as the dance unfolded, a mesmerizing display not merely of steps and rhythm, but of reconciliation, triumph, and transformation. Every movement, every subtle glance between them told a story that words could not capture, the story of a woman reclaimed from the cruel bargains of the past, of a man who had risen above pride and reputation to defend her, to see her as she truly was. Murmurs of astonishment rippled through the crowd, but they were drowned by the quiet power of what was happening at the center of the hall. She felt the weight of the past lift from her shoulders, the whispered betrayals, the hidden slights, the cold calculation of those who had sought to diminish her value, replaced by a sense of empowerment and vindication. And yet it was more than revenge, it was redemption, not just for her, but for the connection that had always existed between them, fragile and tentative, now flourishing into something undeniable. The Duke's voice, low and earnest, brushed against her ear, speaking words that seemed to tether her heart to his, grounding her in a reality that was sweeter and more profound than any pretense could have promised. The chandeliers reflected in her eyes, glinting with unshed tears of relief and joy, as she realized that the life she had feared was no longer dictated by contracts or mercenary interests, but by the recognition of her worth and the unwavering support of someone who chose her fully and without hesitation. and as they glided across the floor, the world seemed to fade away, leaving only the music, the light, and the undeniable truth that her story, once marked by compromise and sorrow, had been rewritten in the most exquisite terms. Love, honor, and redemption had claimed their place at the ball, forever transforming her life in ways she had only dared to dream. Every heart in the room, whether friend or foe, could not ignore the power of that moment, the quiet, yet irrevocable triumph of a woman defended, cherished, and celebrated in front of everyone who had once doubted her. And in that luminous space beneath the glittering chandeliers and the watchful eyes of society, she understood with a clarity that took her breath away. This was not merely a dance, not merely a ball, but the redemption of her spirit, the reclamation of her dignity, and the beginning of a life defined not by bargains or whispers, but by love that would endure far beyond the fleeting scrutiny of the world.